What you're about to see, gentlemen, is a series called The Twilight Zone.
I still remember back in university, our group watched this show every night during weekdays at midnight. The whole dorm started calling us zoneheads, those addicted to the Twilight Zone. For us, 20-year-old students back then, the unexpected twists, the parallel worlds, the monsters on airplane wings made us hold our breath, even though sometimes we did not fully understand the deeper meaning. But it still left a hard-to-fade mark, a feeling of suspense mixed with curiosity, as if the whole room was stepping into a real Twilight Zone together. Later, when we left the dormitory, that series also seemed to disappear from television. It was not until the internet era that I rewatched all 156 episodes, and it was still astonishingly good and haunting. But the more I watched, the more I discovered strange details that I never noticed as a kid. Did you know Anne Francis almost died because of the terrible heat on set? Or that Rod Serling himself wrote more than half of the series in thick cigarette smoke, to the point of shortening his own lifespan? And also the breath-holding decisions one episode was banned from broadcasting for 52 years. Another episode won an Oscar, and Serling once almost walked out of a meeting when the network demanded more frightening details to bait viewership. Today, we will reopen the darkest and strangest backstage doors of the Twilight Zone. 20. Anne Francis almost died while filming The After Hours. Do you still remember? Anne Francis, the beautiful girl with big round eyes and golden hair, in The After Hours, running chaotically among the terrifying mannequins on the top floor of the department store. The first time I watched that episode on a black and white TV, I sat completely still, anxiously following Marsha White in panic, ending with an echoing scream. But behind that haunting scene was a behind-the-scenes story that nearly cost her life. In the summer days of 1960, the set was an old warehouse in Los Angeles without a single air conditioner. The air was suffocating and dust clung to the skin. The lighting equipment at that time, huge 10,000-watt lamps, radiated heat like an oven so hot that the air shimmered. Anne, wearing a tight short dress, had to perform continuously for 6 to 7 hours under that heat, running back and forth along narrow hallways, sweating profusely like being drenched, and her body became severely dehydrated. Suddenly, she became dizzy. Her vision blurred and she had to lean against the wall to avoid collapsing. Medical staff rushed in immediately, measured her blood pressure and gave her sugar water urgently while the entire crew stood silently in worry. After a short break of just 1 hour, barely enough for her to regain strength, the director ordered filming to resume as the schedule did not allow any delay, not even a minute. Anne gritted her teeth and endured it, completing the scene without a single complaint. Later, she recounted that the heat haunted her for a long time, like a reminder of the harshness of Hollywood. In those days, human strength had to be traded for perfect moments on a black and white screen. A small story, but enough to make us appreciate more what we once watched. 19. Rod Serling caused the crew to suffer from smoke poisoning. Anyone who is a devoted fan of Rod Serling would know that he was a true chain smoker. Serling himself admitted many times that whenever he needed to concentrate, he would smoke, while writing scripts during production meetings, even while standing in the middle of the set directing a scene. A cigarette was always between his lips, and smoke billowed like fog in the very stories he told. The Twilight Zone set at that time was small and poorly ventilated, and the hot lights made the smoke even thicker. The smoke became so dense that it blurred the camera lenses, ruined the image, and actors coughed violently during filming, forcing breaks to wipe their eyes. Once, a young actress cried because she couldn't breathe and had to run outside for air. The crew couldn't take it anymore, and eventually installed high-powered fans and makeshift exhaust systems. Noisy fans that roared all day, yet the smell of cigarette smoke still clung to everyone's clothes and hair. Serling knew, but he couldn't stop. But that habit didn't just harm the crew, it slowly consumed him. Repeated heart attacks, and finally the fatal one in 1975, took him at the age of 50. 18. William Shatner almost quit the role twice because of props and monsters. Every time I rewatch the show, I'm always impressed by William Shatner, the pilot Bob Wilson in Nightmare at 20,000 feet. Pale-faced eyes wide open, staring at the monster outside the airplane window. That scene is so haunting that I still get goosebumps even after watching it dozens of times on an old black and white TV. But few people know Shatner almost quit the role because of the very things that made the scene iconic. The first time was because of the monster, a furry creature with a cheap rubber mask looking no different from Halloween costumes in toy stores. When director Richard Donner showed Shatner the model, he got furious out of embarrassment, feeling that the audience would burst out laughing if he had to act scared of such a clumsy prop on a cramped, heat-blasted set. He threatened to refuse filming. Donner calmly advised him to just focus on portraying the true fear of the character, the fear of being alone on a plane with no one believing him. Shatner listened, poured all his emotions into his eyes and trembling voice, and the result was a horror scene that became a symbol, the fear spreading to every viewer, even if the monster looked somewhat silly. The second time was the fortune-telling machine in another episode. The device kept jamming, not working, making Shatner frustrated, having to reshoot dozens of times. He almost gave up because of constant technical issues. But in the end, he persevered, and those very moments contributed to the strange appeal of the series. 17. The Monsters Are Due. On Maple Street was almost banned for being too dangerous, if asked. The episode that impressed me the most is The Monsters Are Due, on Maple Street. The story of a peaceful neighborhood turning into chaos just because of spreading fear. The episode had no real monsters, only people turning into monsters themselves when afraid. But behind that appeal was a tense, behind-the-scenes battle. The script directly touched on McCarthyism, the communist witch hunt era in 1950s America, when everyone suspected everyone. CBS read the script and panicked, thinking the content was too dangerous, too likely to spark social division. They asked Serling to tone it down, add humour, or a positive ending to avoid controversy. Serling flatly refused, even threatening to leave the show if interfered with. He insisted on keeping the message fear can destroy a community faster than any invader. In the end, the network didn't dare cut it, but they pushed the episode to a bad time slot with little advertising and little promotion. Unexpectedly, that burial made it spread even more strongly. Serling won, but the price was months of stress and pressure from the network and sponsors. Watching it again today still gives me chills, not because of monsters, but because I realise that humans can sometimes be scarier than the darkness out there. 16. The Encounter. Episode was banned from broadcast for 52 years. Few people know one of the original episodes. The Encounter was buried for 52 long years. The first time I watched it, I only saw a tense story between two men, a white American war veteran and a young Japanese American, trapped in an attic facing the past of Pearl Harbor. That episode left me silent for a long time after it ended because it was too real, too close to wounds that hadn't healed in America. But that very power became the reason it was banned. CBS received fierce backlash from the Japanese-American community. They believed the script was heavily prejudiced, implicitly blaming some Japanese Americans for the Pearl Harbor attack, even though Serling tried to portray the complexity of loyalty and hatred. In 1964, the network pulled the episode from syndication. No rebroadcasts on TV, not included in any rerun package for decades. It vanished from Twilight Zone history, only surviving in the memories of those who saw it the first time. Not until 2016, when streaming developed and public pressure increased, did CBS allow it to air again, accompanied by a content warning. Banned for 52 years, that episode became a rare dark stain in a series that always prided itself on its humanist message. 15. Serling dodged censorship using science fiction. I still remember the late-night discussions in the dormitory when we argued about the real meaning behind the strange stories of the Twilight Zone. It turned out that Rod Serling was not fascinated by UFOs or aliens at all. He simply wanted to talk about what was happening in real life, the Vietnam War, escalating racial discrimination, simmering beneath the surface dictatorships in many places, and ethical questions that forced people to reconsider themselves. But whenever he submitted scripts directly about those themes, the sponsors and CBS shook their heads. They were afraid of losing advertising from major corporations, afraid of upsetting the audience, afraid of being labelled as politicising a Friday night entertainment programme. Several of Serling's social scripts were rejected outright or edited so heavily that they lost their soul. He bitterly realised that if he spoke directly, he would not be allowed to speak. Serling's solution was a brilliant move. He used science fiction as a perfect protective shell. Aliens stood in for racists, talking dolls stood in for authoritarian leaders, parallel worlds stood in for contemporary American society. He called it a Trojan wooden horse, harmless on the outside, filled with sharp messages on the inside. Thanks to that clever way of bypassing censorship, The Twilight Zone became one of the rare series that dared to criticize society while still surviving through the strictest years of network control. An actor refused to film his death scene because of superstition. A crew member once recounted that during the shooting days of The Purple Testament in the first season, the whole production almost had to stop because of a strange personal belief of William Reynolds, the actor who played Lieutenant William Fitzgerald, a character who saw his comrades' deaths through prophetic dreams, firmly refused to act in the scene where he himself died. He believed that if he acted out his own death on screen, bad luck would really happen to him. At that time, superstition on Hollywood sets was not rare, especially when films dealt with death and fate. Reynolds, a young, promising actor, turned pale when he read the final scene script, the character being shot dead in battle. He shook his head at the director. He couldn't shoot that scene. The crew tried to convince him, but he remained firm. In the end, they had to use a stand-in, a shorter man with a completely different build, to film the death scene. The camera only shot close-ups of Reynolds in earlier scenes, then quickly cut when the death occurred. No one dared to force him for fear of affecting the morale of the entire crew. Reynolds lived to 90 years old, passing away in 2016, and perhaps that belief truly protected him. 13. The original opening sequence was completely different. I still remember the first time I watched The Twilight Zone, the black and white spiral swirling on the screen, followed by Serling's voice echoing through the room, making our entire dorm fall silent. But few people know that the original concept was nothing like that, and it almost never came together. At first, Serling envisioned himself standing among countless doors, opening in every direction, each door leading to a different dimension, symbolizing the journey into the zone. It was a clever and highly symbolic idea, but the technology in 1959 simply could not keep up. The black and white cameras, the crude special effects, the limited lighting and the overlapping set of doors made everything look messy, hazy, and even caused blown highlights during test shoots. The crew tried multiple times, but it was a disaster. Instead of mystery, it produced confusion and failed to convey the feeling of entering something otherworldly. In the end, they had to pivot quickly, replacing the doors with an abstract spiral, pairing it with eerie theme music and a concise narration. The result was unexpectedly iconic. That black and white vortex became a timeless visual symbol, simple, haunting, and instantly recognizable from the very first note. 12. The iconic opening narration came from a compromise. At first, The Twilight Zone had no opening narration, only visuals, no music, no voiceover. When the pilot was sent to the network executives, the first response was silence. Then came a very honest question. What genre is this? No one knew how to promote it. Science fiction, horror, psychological drama. None of them fit. Rod Serling was called into the studio. There was no long-term plan, no creative team. He sat down, wrote a few lines, then read them himself. Just once. Not much editing. That voice wasn't high, not theatrical, just steady, clear, and something about it caught people's attention. as if someone was inviting you to step through a strange door but without forcing you. That narration became an inseparable mark of the show. Audiences only needed to hear the first few seconds to know where they were. No images needed, no colours. Sometimes the greatest icons are born from very human uncertainty. 11. Audience backlash due to racism. The episode. The Big Tall Wish was one of the rare cases where an entire cast consisted of black actors. The little boy Bobby and the boxer Bowley Jackson, with performances so genuine that viewers held their breath. No monsters, no aliens, just a story about belief and miracles through a child's eyes. However, the audience's reaction shocked the entire crew. Some people sent harsh protest letters, turned off their TVs the moment they saw the actors' skin colour, even threatened to cancel their subscriptions. At that time, black actors in lead roles were still extremely rare on American television, and racial prejudice lingered deeply in society. CBS received dozens of complaint letters, and some local stations refused to air the episode. Serling and the crew were well aware of the risks, but he firmly kept the script as it was, a subtle message about hope overcoming racial barriers. Looking back today, that episode was not just a touching story. It was proof of Serling's courage in bringing sensitive issues to national television. Though it was boycotted, it still endured and came to be recognised as a small step forward in American TV history. 10. Brutal shooting schedule. 8 days from script to air. Lead actors once stated that the early days of filming Twilight Zone were the most terrifying. Not because of the creepy scripts, but because of the relentless pace. Only 8 days from receiving the script to airing, everything had to be perfect from the first take. No time for trial, no extra takes, no long post-production, like today's films. Actors often received their lines on the morning of filming. They had to memorise them right on set, amid the noise of lights, machinery and props. Many trembled while holding the script, muttering lines during makeup, then plunged straight into filming without any rehearsal. Editors worked 20 hours a day, cutting footage late into the night, eyes burning from cigarette smoke and strong black coffee. Serling wrote scripts. At midnight, directors gave constant instructions. Technicians rushed around fixing broken equipment. On some days, a scene failed because the actors were exhausted, but no one dared stop. The broadcast schedule was already printed in the papers, and the audience was waiting. Hollywood in those days was harsh. No modern labour safety, no proper insurance, and everyone accepted exhaustion to keep up the pace. That madness gave the series its unique energy, fast, sharp, with no excess. 9. The iconic theme song was only introduced in Season 2. Even those who have never seen The Twilight Zone are familiar with the catchy Dee 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 tune of its theme song. However, this song was not used in the first season of the show. The original theme was composed by Bernard Herrmann, known for working with Alfred Hitchcock on films like Psycho 1960, and although it had a haunting tone, it didn't leave a strong impression. CBS was looking for a new theme, and Lud Gluskin, the program's music director, hired Marius Constant, who usually composed ballet music, to give it a try. Constant composed 2 pieces, Milieu No. 2 and Étrange No. 3, which Gluskin then combined to create the new theme. This song became an essential part of the show's identity. Even though the theme was remixed in various versions of The Twilight Zone, the memorable 4-note guitar riff always remained. 8. The network wanted a star. Serling chose a regular man, Burgess Meredith, with his thick glasses and skinny figure sitting among piles of ruined books. After the Apocalypse is an unforgettable image, but few know the role was not originally meant for him. He was Serling's choice despite CBS's strong objections. They wanted a big star to attract viewers to make the advertising easier to sell. But Meredith didn't look glamorous enough, didn't have the star power for that. Still, Serling insisted he saw real loneliness in the character Henry Bemis, a book lover rejected by society who ultimately lost everything just because of a pair of broken glasses. He believed the audience would relate more to an ordinary man than to a movie idol. After it aired, the network was silent. No more complaints, The episode became one of the most iconic in television history, mentioned again and again over the years. 7. The show was almost cancelled in its first season. In the early months of 1959, I often felt nervous every time I turned on the TV to watch Twilight Zone, because I knew the series was on the verge of cancellation. Ratings were unstable, fluctuating not as consistent as popular comedies or westerns of the time. CBS began to lose patience and called an emergency meeting with Serling and the producers. They wanted changes, more romance, more dramatic action, more accessible elements to retain viewers. Weird sci-fi like this is hard to sell ads for, one network executive said. Serling got angry, stood up and left the meeting without a word. He knew that if he compromised, Twilight Zone would lose its identity. No longer a place for deep stories, just cheap entertainment. Luckily, pressure from critics and a group of loyal viewers saved it. They recognised the series' unique value. Not everything needed action or romance. Sometimes a thought-provoking story was enough. The show was renewed, but not out of trust. It was because pop culture had begun to shift and Serling had been right. 6. The origin of the name. The Twilight Zone. Serling once said in an old interview that he thought he had invented the phrase. It sounded good. Mysterious, evoking a transition between light and dark, between reality and dream. But then he realised he might have heard it somewhere and forgotten. The term actually came from the US Air Force, referring to the moment when a plane lands in fog or twilight, when the pilot can no longer clearly see the horizon. Everything falling into a vague area between light and shadow. Serling had served as a paratrooper in World War II, and maybe he heard his comrades mention it during night flights, unconsciously storing it in his memory. In oceanography, Twilight Zone also refers to the ocean's mesopelagic layer, where sunlight barely reaches between the bright surface and the dark, deep sea. Whatever the origin, the name has now become a symbol used to describe surreal, strange moments in everyday life. Serling didn't know that from a little-known military term, he would turn it into a cultural legacy, a twilight realm that millions of people stepped into every Friday night. 5. One episode won an Oscar. Few people know that by season 5, Serling had run out of ideas, and the budget was so tight that every episode had to be calculated carefully. I still remember my surprise when watching An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge aired as a regular Twilight Zone episode. Not much dialogue, just slow black and white images telling the story of a Confederate soldier being hanged during the American Civil War, then a brief dream of escape before reality returns. But that episode wasn't produced by the Twilight Zone crew. Producer William Frew bought the rights to the French short film by director Robert Enrico for only $25,000, much cheaper than the average $65,000 cost to produce an episode themselves. They trimmed it, slightly added Serling's narration, and ending, then broadcast it in 1964. No one expected the film had already won Best Short Film at the 1962 Cannes Film Festival and the 1963 Academy Award for Best Live Action Short. It became the only Twilight Zone episode to win an Oscar, proof of the power of pure artistry, even with limited budgets. 4. No composer hired library music became the show's DNA. Few people know that most of the music in the series wasn't composed specifically for it. The budget was so limited that they couldn't afford to hire a composer for each episode, so the crew used stock music. Existing tracks from music libraries reused across documentaries, commercials, and stage plays. These tracks often had generic names like Suspense Cue Number 12 or Mysterious Theme carefully selected to match the mysterious atmosphere. At first, it was just background music, but gradually it blended perfectly with Serling's narration, with the sudden twists with the flickering light and shadow on the black and white screen. Viewers could no longer tell stock music apart from the unique identity of Twilight Zone. It became an inseparable part of the show. 3. Serling wrote 92 out of 156 episodes himself. Did you know Rod Serling personally wrote 92 out of the total 156 episodes of The Twilight Zone? Over half the show bore his personal imprint. Every day he woke up at 4 a.m., sat at the typewriter amid clouds of cigarette smoke and typed each line of script. Then he went to the studio to make edits, came home in the evening and continued writing until late at night. That schedule was so harsh, he barely had time to rest. Serling believed that if others wrote too much, the series would lose its identity, losing the deep, satirical and humanistic tone he wanted to convey. He once told friends if he didn't write it himself, he couldn't control the message. But the cost was rapid deterioration of health, chronic stress, constant smoking leading to early heart attacks. He died at 50, leaving behind a monumental legacy. 2. One episode almost bankrupted the entire show. The episode The Odyssey of Flight 33, the story of a plane lost in a strange time zone, nearly bankrupted the entire program. Special effects model airplanes and complex filming pushed costs far beyond the budget. The season's finances were already tight, and Serling and the producers had to urgently find a solution. The fix: he wrote 3 ultra-cheap episodes himself, requiring almost no major effects, no elaborate locations, relying solely on acting simple sets and sharp ideas. These were The Midnight Sun, The Earth Drifts Off Orbit, Temperatures Keep Rising, 5 Characters in Search of an Exit, 5 People Trapped in a Mysterious Cylinder, and Time. Enough at last, a book lover survives the apocalypse. Ironically, those cheap episodes became the most iconic of the series, praised for their psychological depth, unexpected twists, and powerful humanist messages. They proved that strong ideas and tight scripts matter more than huge budgets. 1. Death's Head. Revisited, confronted the Holocaust on TV when no one else dared. In 1961, when the Holocaust was still a subject, American television avoided like the plague. Serling brought Death's Head Revisited to air. The episode tells the story of a former SS officer returning to the Dachau concentration camp, haunted and tortured eternally by the victims who died there. No aliens, no sci-fi twist, just the brutal reality of human atrocity. CBS hesitated but eventually aired it. Advertisers pulled out in droves and some local stations refused to broadcast it for fear of backlash. Serling received threatening pressure from every direction, but he remained firm, once saying, "If television doesn't dare tell the truth, it's worthless." The episode didn't flinch. It directly faced the crematoriums, the fate of the Jewish people, the responsibility of the perpetrators. Watching it today still chills me, because of its power and entertainment program daring to bring the Holocaust into American homes when most of society wasn't ready. That was Twilight Zone's bravest moment, not because of supernatural horror, but because it dared to tell the darkest truth in history. Serling didn't just tell stories, he forced us to look. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, share and subscribe so you won't miss our next videos. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear from you. See you in the next video.